Welcome, everybody, to the Amazon Q podcast. I'm Chris Shea. I'm a solutions architect at Amazon Web Services, and I'm joined today by Trevor Spires, a senior solutions architect at Amazon Web Services. Today, we're going to be talking at depth about Model Context Protocol, MCP. Trevor, it's so great to have you on the show. I really appreciate you making time for this.
Oh, of course, Chris. I've been looking forward to it. This is like one of my favorite topics, MCP. So thanks for having me on.
Let's jump right into it. MCP, Model Context Protocol. What is it, Trevor?
Sure. I mean, we can break it down to its three words: Model Context Protocol. So it is a protocol to enrich contexts of large language models. So the analogy I like is from the creators of MCP, Anthropic, who defined the protocol last year. They describe it as a USB-C port for large language models, but people should think of it as just an easy, standardized way to plug any tool into a large language model to extend its capabilities. So people may have heard about agents. It's kind of like agents, but a standard way to make models do things that you want them to do and interface with tools you want them to interface with.
I think what's so exciting about that, too, is the fact that we're really seeing a huge shift, and I think it's related very heavily to agentic AI. How you don't just have a prompt-based text output from an LLM that you have to then, paste into a different format or work with. Like, you can actually have these, with the power of MCP, have AI models take action on your behalf and know how to, in a standardized format, integrate with other tools and resources. And I think that's huge.
Absolutely, yeah. I've been having this conversation with customers a lot lately around agents and MCP, and the discussion is like, we often are familiar with the idea of going to a chat bot or an AI and asking it a question and having it turn a response. But what if you could build something that it gives your user the answer before they have to ask for it, right? So imagine like logging in at the beginning of the day and having like a briefing of all of your meetings and all of your important to-dos for the day. Or another example, I work with a customer that recently we co-authored a solution with to send stock digests to customers effectively, proactively on demand. And that's got me thinking a lot more of asynchronous agents with MCP potentially that are just working for us behind the scenes. And that's like a whole other level of productivity I think folks don't always think about when they're stuck in copy-paste chatbot mode.
Yeah, and I've seen that myself too. Like, I think a great example too of what we're seeing here and how MCP can really be effectively utilized with AWS tech right now is the Q Developer CLI, command line interface. What I've noticed is it's offered broad support for Model Context Protocol, MCP servers, right? And we can get into the concept of, versus a server. I know it's like a client server architecture. Yep. Would love to hear a bit more about that too. Really, what's really cool is it's able to offload a lot of the tasks that are very time consuming, but not necessarily linked to my direct day-to-day role, right? Like, as architects, we spend a ton of time in diagramming tools constantly, right? But our main focus should be on the actual architecture that we're really just translating into a visual format, right? However, when you're using these tools, a lot of it can be, very granular aesthetic details, getting an arrow to connect to another box. It can kind of drive you crazy, especially under a time crunch. I think we've all been there.
Yeah.
Well, with the QCLI, I've been able to have an MCP server dedicated just to generating architecture diagrams based on the current state of an AWS account. You can link it up directly in the QCLI, and I've been able to get it to create architecture diagrams on the fly in PNG format, XML format, really any format of your choosing. And it's been a game changer for my productivity.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I think in general, this is a tool that's like hyper accessible to developers because virtually every IDE, including most of the Q tools, Kiro, who folks may have heard about more recently, come ship with some MCP native hooks to be able to plug right into servers. And so I think that's the adoption curve that we're actually seeing right now is like today, it's primarily a tool used by developers and hackers to build out their own workflows. However, tomorrow, and I think the future kind of what we see coming together now is like actually using this to build an enterprise agent. But that's very cool. I have the same experience with my coding companion. For me, like some of the MCPs that are really valuable in my day-to-day work are diagram generation MCPs. PowerPoint generation MCPs have been incredible for me. And then things that integrate with my like calendar and mail and things like that go a long way for me since I'm spending most of my time communicating with customers.
You're blowing my mind here. We could use MCP to create slide decks.
Right? Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
If spending time in diagramming tools takes up that big of a chunk of time, you can imagine how much time is spent building out slide decks and just preparing the aesthetics of what the real root technology is, which is what I think where we really want to invest our time regardless, right? So I'm already getting ideas here. Like the gears are turning, even as we're talking about it, how we could use MCP.
Yeah, I mean, while we're on the topic, I'll highlight my other favorite use case as a solutions architect here at AWS is so many times we need to go into calls kind of showing customers an example of a piece of technology. I think we refer to it as like art of the possible, but like a demo or a prototype, and being able to just completely kind of outsource that and prompt it into existence with MCP, particularly MCP servers that can integrate with AWS native services, AWS documentation. I find myself before a call, I used to spend hours prepping, and now it's just a few prompts of putting together a demo or a benchmark, and usually I can come into with something pretty well formed in a customer conversation.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point with like AWS MCP servers as well. So we maintain our own repository of official AWS MCP servers, correct?
We absolutely do. In fact, I was just down the road in another New York office with our PACE team. It's a team that works really closely with our customers and SAs in the field, and they maintain a repo of 50 plus different MCP servers now, including MCP servers to interface with AWS documentation and now to interface directly with AWS service APIs, right? So if you're an AWS customer, or even if you're not an AWS expert and you need to be able to interface with AWS a little bit in your day-to-day job, it can be a real uplift for what you're capable of. I'll give you a specific example. Actually, I have a customer who they have a central AWS team, and they have developers kind of deploying into their Kubernetes clusters. And these developers aren't AWS experts, but they still need to do things like request IAM roles and AWS resources. And so being able to use MCPs that can programmatically read AWS documentation and then generate the Terraform code in a way that's like least privileges for a given IAM role. Those are the sort of things where it's like that would have maybe been 10 Slack exchanges back and forth between a developer and a security engineer prior to this, and now it's purely something that somebody in a dev team can kind of offload to the AI.
Fantastic. So I want to hear a little bit more about some of the use cases that you've come across for MCP as well, Trevor.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are both sides of the coin, use cases with customers and then use cases like that I use in my day to day. Like what do you want to dig into first?
I would say, like, is there any, I'd say, surprising use case for MCP that you didn't realize it could do, and then you're like, wait, there's a server for this?
Yeah, I do think that happens a lot. In fact, like MCP is one of the fastest growing protocols on earth right now, and there's tens of thousands of MCP servers being created every month. So this happens all the time where I'm kind of delighted by a new MCP server. I'll tell you one personally. I'm a big user of, there's an AWS customer partner called Perplexity, and they have this deep research tool. And I never thought about what it could mean to combine any deep research tool with a model, because and if folks who aren't familiar, a deep research tool is effectively a tool that just does a bunch of research on your behalf about a topic. But if you pre-prompt a model with deep research, you're able to really automate a lot of the configuration of a context window. So if, like, for example, I might have a deep research tool research a particular service or technology or account prior to doing a build about it. So I think it's those little nuances of really being able to inject more energy into a model context. And I would say on the flip side with my customers, like I work in financial services, and everybody wants to figure out, every financial services customer has some huge data lake that they've been building out for years and years, and they oftentimes have tools that investors or developers will use to interface with that data lake. And so virtually everybody wants an MCP server to front end that massive data lake that they've accrued over the last decade, so that way they can interface with the data programmatically and just inject it into more people's workflows. And so I'd say that's a really simple one where it could just be a single MCP server potentially fronting a really important data source and kind of unlocking what's inside of a data lake to folks that are not just developers who can write SQL code.
For sure. And I think what's really great too, to tie it from it's a technical solution that can solve business problems, right? And I think some of the obvious benefits that occur to me, it's like amount of time saved, right? For developers. Anything else that comes to mind?
And speed too. I think there are instances where with AI, you're able to consume and aggregate information so much faster in real time from 100 sources at one time. It's pretty easy to map it to just a human productivity workflow. Like if I'm a let's say I'm an analyst and I'm researching 5 different companies in my portfolio. Think about all the different clicks that an analyst might go through of researching online, looking at reports. There's so many different threads of that now an AI can do all of those things at the same time. So what might have taken you an afternoon or day or a week can really be summarized in minutes, maybe an hour. And I think that can't be overstated. How that allows us to reinvest time in higher level tasks.
Absolutely. And I want to like specifically highlight too, like the AWS API MCP server as well, right? So now you're able to have a system that can basically run API calls on your AWS account as well.
Absolutely. It's been an awesome partnership with the AWS product teams that are kind of building out the interfaces for this. And recently there has been a change here where the services were developing individual MCP servers. So there was like a Lambda MCP and an S3 MCP, but now they have just an AWS MCP that has all of our major services loaded into it. And so imagine that having one component that now unlocks your ability to paint with the canvas that is AWS primitives and services through natural language.
I find it pretty interesting how they basically did what MCP did for MCP in its own way by consolidating that and standardizing across a variety of different services.
Yeah.
So dialing down into some of the more technical elements of MCP, right? I'd love to talk, at least a high level, right, about some of the technical terminology that's used here. I know it's, generally, what would really an MCP server look like from a developer's point of view? Is this something that they build? How do they access them?
Yeah, so there's a few ways to think of it. So first of all, the MCP protocol is a client-server protocol, which if you've been in technology for a while, it's a very standard kind of architecture of a protocol where you have a client that initiates requests, and then you have a server that understands those requests and speaks back and forth. Now, an MCP server itself is generally just, depending on its complexity, a few lines of Python code, right? And it's usually a written in Python because that's kind of the language of AI. And inside of that server, you define different things. Like, for example, you define tools. Tools might be APIs or systems that you read and write to. You define resources, which oftentimes are like static instructions or documents. But those live inside the server. And so think of that server as a small, almost like a database that just understands all of the systems on the back end that it's automating. And in the example of AWS, that server would hold all these different API calls for all of our different storage services, for example. So that's the server. And then on the front end, you have a client. And an MCP client can take many different forms. You could build your own. I'd say most customers are using a standard orchestrator. Like you said, a Q CLI is an incredible MCP client. There's some great open source ones out there as well. And that client, it goes through a pretty typical handshake of just asking the server, "Hey server, what tools do you have?" So you might say, "Hey server, what AWS services do you know about?" And it would spit back, "I know about S3, I know about DynamoDB," and all of this happens transparently to the user. I think that's actually the magic of it. Is we can talk a lot about MCP, but if there's one thing I could compel people to do that are listening, it is to like install a tool that's capable of using MCP. And just use one server, because even though there's this complex technical handshake that's happening, very much like a TCP handshake on the back end, from the user experience level, it really looks just like AI is doing magic on your behalf, like orchestrating and automating all of these things.
I can really attest to that too, right? Like when you're working with agentic AI systems, and from my personal experience, working with agentic AI, especially with the advent of MCP servers now that are able to really level that playing field and standardize how we interact with these tools, it does feel like magic. No other way to describe it.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about the learning curve for MCP as well, right? You're very well versed on this topic, but how long did it take to pick up?
I think what's great about AI these days is it's pretty easy to pick up most new concepts. AI is really good at understanding technical things and explaining it to people in a very simple way. So I would say really the requirement to in fact, I'd back up. There's really 2 ways to think about MCP from a learning perspective. You could think of just being an MCP user, in which case you might be an individual developer that wants to build out your own workflows in your IDE or in a CLI tool. In that case, the learning curve is very, very small. Like if you're a developer that already knows how to use Git, it's a pretty logical next step to learn how to configure and deploy an MCP server and use that in your workflow. So I'd say that side of it, of just deploying it and using it, is folks could do it in 10 minutes. You could probably code your way into setting up an MCP environment. Now, if you actually want to start building MCP servers, that's maybe another layer deeper. However, like I mentioned earlier, there's like tens of thousands of MCP servers being developed every day, which means that there's millions of lines of referenceable MCP code already out on the internet. And so I'm actually, it's funny to say, but I've probably built, I don't know, 30 different MCP servers at this point, but I've never actually coded an MCP server. Like MCP builds all of my MCP, right? So I would say if I'm going to recap that and give somebody a phased approach, it's like step one is just get a tool that can use MCP and start playing around with the tool. And then eventually you might have a creative thought of like, oh man, it would be really interesting if I could also integrate this workflow into my calendar or this app that I really use or this notes tool. And then that's where you might build your first MCP server yourself to see what that looks like. But I think I would say it's something that anybody that has some very basic understanding of coding can get started with anytime.
And are there any specific learning resources that you found particularly helpful picking it up?
I personally referenced our official AWS MCP repo. So if you just search AWS MCP servers, it should show up on the top of your preferred search engine, because within that repo, there's 50 plus MCP servers that you can look inside of and see the code. And it's very simple, elegant code that's relatively easy to understand semantically. So I think finding a server that you want to use that's open source is what I would suggest, because then you can use it. You start by using it, and then after you use it, you can look inside and see all of what's happening inside of the server to kind of deepen your understanding.
Yeah, and you mentioned just like I feel users are spoiled for choice when it comes to the number of different options that they have when they're trying to pick an MCP server, right? Do you have any recommendations on how to really narrow it down to find the right MCP server for your use case?
I mean, I can only say I am the right one for your use case should come pretty naturally, but there are some basic MCP servers I think everybody should be running, right? So for example, you probably need a GitHub MCP server. You probably need some tool use or some sort of computer use MCP server that can open up a browser, right? You almost certainly, and I would say if you're just looking for a starting point, I'm a big fan of the AWS MCP servers. If you're listening to this podcast, maybe you're an AWS user. And so that would be a really logical starting point, is using some free tier services via MCP on AWS.
Makes a ton of sense. That's, I think, a pretty great starting point there.
No.
Do you have any general advice for folks who want to get started with MCP but aren't sure quite where to begin?
I think everybody knows themselves well. For me, I'm the type of learner who I want to get hands-on, or I want to watch. I love watching videos and seeing people use the tool. And so I would suggest that for folks. But again, I think the number one piece of advice I could give anyone here is just, it's actually a sneaky simple to use MCP. And you can talk about the theory of it and you can kind of try to understand it theoretically, but just get an IDE that's capable of it. Deploy a single MCP server like an AWS MCP server and start using it. I think it creates a flywheel, because seeing it work makes it much more real than trying to understand all of the complex intricacies of prompts being converted to API calls back and forth.
Of course. And I think another good question too, that really, I think that kind of sparks up for me, is what exactly would you say? Because I know with MCP, right, it on paper really does closely resemble like an API in a way, right? So what's the difference between using MCP compared to just like a standard REST API?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, this is one of the most common questions when I'm running an MCP workshop that a customer will ask. There's a lot of similarities. I think that there's two big things that I think about when I'm thinking MCP versus API. First of all, not everything has an API, and so there are some systems that you may want to interface with that would require a different type of orchestration. So imagine you're a company. I'll go back to the example of I'm a financial services company that has like a data API, right? Imagine now it's late 2025, 2026, you've got a few agents in deployment. And without something like MCP, what that looks like is, let's say you have 10 agents deployed. Each of those 10 agents will have their own integration. So you have 10 integrations built with this data API. And that may not sound that bad at surface level, but when you think about enterprise tooling, enterprises really care about, like, does the right person with the right permissions have access to this data? And there's also a productivity angle of, like, do you really want to be building the same API integration 10 different times with what was the standard before MCP, which was tool calls within LLMs. Fast forward to MCP, now you have the capability to build a single MCP server for a data source in this example, and have all of your agents plug into that in a systematic way. And so I think it prevents the kind of bespoke nature of tool calls within agents. And it also just makes it such that it's easier to orchestrate agentic behavior, because the other pattern here is, prior to MCP, to build something agentic, you needed an agentic framework. So you would have needed a Strands or like a LangChain, or there's many different agentic frameworks out there. But that's those are pretty complex. And even still, there's some development overhead involved with those tools. There's just much less code to build an agent when you're using MCP. It's a very natural language driven, and I think that allows people to move faster. And I've even seen instances where people who are non-technical, like we have a wonderful technical program manager on our PACE team named Anita, who wasn't a programmer in a past life, but is able to produce all of these incredible demos and assets using MCP because it's not so technical and difficult to wrangle for a non-developer.
Yeah, really democratizes it.
Yeah.
Even for folks who maybe don't come from a software development background. And I think that's one of the huge advantages of agentic AI in general, right? Is how it really opens those doors for people too. So very exciting stuff. I do want to ask a little bit about you too. How did you initially get into tech?
For me, from a young age in high school, I kind of saw it as a way to start a career and get my feet underneath me from a life perspective. So my path was, I joined the military whenever I was 18 years old, and I joined the U.S. Air Force as effectively a network administrator. So I started running cables through brick buildings with that you couldn't bring cell phones inside of. They called skiffs, and configuring routers, switches, firewalls for the U.S. military. And then it's kind of just been a natural progression from there. I've always been ever since I got into technology, I bet a lot of folks listening would empathize with this. I just kind of wanted to understand. As soon as I understood TCP/IP and packets and networking, I just wanted to understand how everything fit together. It's always been like a big puzzle to me of like, whoa, the internet works. Whoa, like people are deploying all these different applications. And I think it's been the pursuit of just trying to understand how all this stuff works has led me to transition from initially networking, then into the data center for a few years. And now I'm very lucky to have gone through the cloud era and be right in the middle of it all during this AI thing that we're going through.
What a time to be in the business, right?
It's why I feel grateful, lucky every day. I always thought like, man, like I got out of college and kind of started my career after the early 2000s and like the .com boom. And I always thought like, oh, wow, wouldn't have been really cool to be a part of some big transformation like that. And here we are I think the first inning of what is going to be a probably decades long transformation. And we get to be part of taking it to customers. I mean, like what else could you want as a technologist?
It's incredible. And I'm curious too, how that early career experience also shaped what you do today. Were there any major takeaways from those early days of putting together chicken quesadillas? I read the LinkedIn. I did.
Oh yeah, that's right. I worked at Taco Bell briefly. That had no connection to getting into tech, but it was a fun job, and I do love a good quesadilla. I think there was an epiphany that I had a few years into my career, right as I got out of the military, which was effectively that technology, like a lot of network engineers, I fell in love with the tech. I fell in love with, I was thinking of packets in my dreams, and I was deep in Wireshark, and I was loving technology for the sake of learning, and that's good. It's incredible to learn, but I had this moment towards the end of my Air Force enlistment where it hit me that like all of this technology is just a means to an end. It is like these are just these are insignificant compared to what they can accomplish, and that may seem like a silly realization, but for me, what that led me to was understanding that I need to constantly be refreshing and throwing out and learning new things, because all these technical skills that I have are actually in service of the U.S. government or a financial services customer or Amazon's business. And really the technology is just a means to an end. I think that framing allowed me to let go of that identity of being a network engineer and open up to the idea of just being like a generalist architect that has been able to evolve with the industry around me.
What do you think's next? I know MCP is one of the biggest topics at the forefront of everyone's mind right now, especially with the advent of agentic AI. But what do you think is on the horizon?
In my mind, it's actually pretty clear what's on the horizon, because as you use AI tools, you can still feel some of the sharp edges. Like sometimes the AI won't do exactly what you want it to do, and or sometimes even in the case of MCP, this will happen a lot actually, where you ask an AI to build an app for you, and instead of building exactly what you asked, it will build like a mock version of what you asked, and it will work. The demo will work, but it won't be like the working functionality. And so I think those are just some small gaps, not in MCP, but actually in the intelligence workhorse of the app and in the model itself, that naturally over time we should overcome. So I believe by this time next year, just seeing how far agentic coding models have gone in the last 12 months, we'll be at a point where you truly can, in a hands-off way, have AI do a lot of coding and kind of heavy lifting of writing application code for you. And we're there today to an extent, but I do think that we're going to take our hands more and more off the wheel as developers as we build more trust and the models become more capable. Outside of that, it's kind of hard for me to imagine beyond that, because in this world, thinking more than a couple of years out feels pretty impossible, because I just know how different it is now than it was 12 months ago.
For sure. And I don't think either of us know the future, but I think what we can say with certainty is that the present is pretty incredible. To give you some context, on the train ride up here, I was able to build an entire commute planning application in Python using Kiro, and it took me about 30 minutes, not even. I'd say that's a very generous estimate.
Yeah.
It's incredible how quickly you can get from just an initial idea to a very, very fleshed out prototype with the power of AI tooling like Kiro. It's pretty amazing, and that's impossible without MCP under the covers.
MCP
or under the hood.
Yeah, it's got a what would you say? For me, it feels like there were coding assistants last year, and now there's these MCP enabled coding agents. I would say my coding productivity feels like it's probably 4 or 5x in this paradigm, where we've evolved from autocomplete of code to actually agentic coding. I don't know. How do you feel it as a force multiplier?
I think it's been an absolute force multiplier, right? And I think, to put it kind of more in layman's terms, what I've noticed is just how much less time I have to spend doing a lot of, I think, some of that more menial development, right? So like writing unit tests, writing documentation, right? Like you can very quickly get a README file that's able to talk about like your database schema, prerequisites, any type of dependencies that you need to have installed. I think that's a big thing too. If you're working on a new project that requires a couple new dependencies, right? Like just fighting with the terminal in your IDE to get to a stage where you have everything installed so the application can even run, right? Having just basically like a battle buddy on the sidelines here that can help talk through what you need to do in order to get all those dependencies installed and running, even just some of that basic foundational stuff. So imagine how easy it is now if you're a junior developer or just someone getting into the craft, right? How much easier it is to get started with the power of AI.
Absolutely. I would say I would have called myself a novice coder until AI came out a few years ago, to be honest. I was writing some simple Python script, and now it's like I'm constantly amazed at what you're capable of. And I think it will drive a lot of people to maybe follow in our paths and become more generalists, actually, because I think the role of a developer might transform a little bit more into being focused on converting requirements into the instructions that deliver the code, rather than just taking the instructions from a project manager or a PM to implement it yourself.
I think that's the trend that we're really going to be seeing as well, right? Is everyone can be a generalist with the power of AI. I think it really does help level that playing field. I'm very excited to see what the future holds. This is some really, really impressive technology. So, Trevor, thank you so much for coming on the show. I've certainly learned a lot. It's been fantastic hearing your insight on MCP. I hope to have you on again sometime. But any parting thoughts for the crowd before we part ways tonight?
No, I'm going to sound like a broken record. No parting thoughts. Thanks for having me on. I would say if you haven't done it yet, folks, download an MCP server in your IDE, give it a try, and reach out to Chris and I. Let us know how it went for you. We'd love to hear what your experience has been like.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for watching.